You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Thursday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. You're also watching the simulcast in video over on my YouTube channel and hopefully joining the live chat room that is there of all the fellow Intrep heads. You can find that over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Welcome to the show tonight. There's all kinds of things to talk about. I am dramatically shifting gears and going into a different topic tonight than what we've been on for, the last week or two, off and on, politics a little bit, constitutional law, things like that. And I want to get back into talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And that is the Native American history, the Native American experience. And of course, it's not going to be exhausted in one episode, so we'll see what we'll do with this. But I'm heavily leaning on Dee Brown's book, Bury My Hearted Wounded Knee. And if you would like to pick up a good book, I don't have it here on my desk or I'd show it to you, go pick up Dee Brown's Bury My Hearted Wounded Knee. It is the Native American perspective of the winning, quote-unquote, of the American West and the westward expansion of the United States. And it is a sad story. It's necessary history, but the way Dee Brown writes it, he writes it from his perspective as a Native American and from the Native American perspective of the loss of their homeland during the expansion of the American West into the American West by the United States, mostly in the 19th century, though it started much earlier than that. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight as kind of a way of reintroducing this topic that we talked about almost a year ago when we talked about Wounded Knee and the battle at Wounded Knee. Also the massacre at Wounded Knee that took place in the 1970s. And so, and it was really not a battle at Wounded Knee in the 1890s either. Both were massacres. Well, one was a massacre, one was a standoff that ended up with people still in prison over that. And we talked about that back in the day, or at the time a year ago. But I want to expand a bit more into this. You know, Rocky Stucci and I, we do a little paranormal investigating and research on the side, and we visited places like Fort Snelling, where we've talked extensively about that, about our experiences there on a couple of different occasions, about the voices we'd pick up on the spirit box. I don't know where you all stand on that sort of thing, but in our experience, which is only anecdotal, of course, things like the spirit box can work if you use them right and you know what you're listening to. And the last time we were there, just about 6 weeks ago or so, we were picking up all kinds of native voices on that spirit box. We were picking up Lakota language, and so it was very interesting. And if you remember, just to refresh your memory, even though Rocky and I have mentioned this several times, when we were there last fall, we were standing on the spot that was the concentration camp at the base of the fort down on the river flats below the bluffs of Fort Snelling in what is really the inner city of Minneapolis. And down on the river flats there, they had a concentration camp where they housed over 1,700 Native American men, women, and children who were all taken into the camp after the Dakota Wars in Minnesota in the 1860s. And in the winter of 1862, almost 300 men, women, and children died at that concentration camp due to the weather, the conditions, the exposure, as well as deprivation, starvation, illness. And so when Rocky and I were there the first time back last autumn, we were picking up voices on the spirit box. And it's not so much that you get voices on a spirit box, is that you get responsive voices. Voices that will answer your questions, voices that will speak directly to the topic that you're speaking to the air. And we're standing in broad daylight out in the woods where this concentration camp stood. It's now, of course, a state park, and there's biking paths and walking paths all through it. And there we stood, but there was no signage saying this is the site where the concentration camp stood, albeit there is a memorial that was put up by the Dakota tribe that's at the front of the paths and near the right off of the car park, which is in front of the visitors center down below the fort. And so we're standing on where we thought was the spot, and we triangulated this through different photographs in the 1860s showing the camp and where it would have stood, and maps that say this is where it was. And so we're down there, and we're getting voices coming over the spirit box, and we're talking. Rocky was there with me. Sarah Soderlund was there. A few weeks ago it was Sarah, Rocky, and Rainey. And while we're listening to the voices coming through, there was one final question we asked, and you've heard this story before if you're a regular listener. But I asked of the voices, I said, of course we were trying to establish first, were you here when this was a concentration camp? Did you die here? Are you related to anybody who was here? And we're getting voices coming across affirming that. And I asked, finally at the end, I said, if there's anybody here that would like to tell us something, could you please tell us what message would you like us to pass on to people? And immediately a strong male voice came out of the box and said, remember us. And I thought that was very profound. It still gives me chills talking about that. And, you know, I'm not too easily duped by these things. I'm not a rube who fell off the turnip cart yesterday. We've been around the block with these things for 20 years. And so getting that voice was very strong. I believe we did record it, but it was coming out of the voice box that we had. And so this is the kind of, my experience is not one of being Native American. I am not Native American in the indigenous peoples sense. I am Native American because my Welsh ancestors came and settled in the colonies in Virginia in 1710. And so we've been for 310 years, my family has been in America. I think after 3 centuries, you can safely say if you're born here, you are Native American. But not in the sense of the people group, of the indigenous peoples group. So I'm not an Indian. I'm not Native American. I don't have a tribe here. I'm a white guy from Welsh stock and Welsh heritage. I'm Caucasian. That's what I mean by being a white guy. And but I have a great interest in this. And many of you have met via the radio show my good friend Reuben Fasthorse, who is Lakota Sioux, and he's a Native American language revivalist. He has taught with the New York University Language Revival. And he's a very strong, peaceful, centered man who wants to revive some of these old traditions and these old ways so it's not forgotten. And I asked him about our visiting this site, and I said, do you think that's something proper for us to do? And he says, oh, by all means, yes. And I asked him, I said, what do you think of a Washti, a white man that is interested in Native American issues and advocates for Native American issues and stands with Native American people and Native American history? And he said, I love it. And he said, You'll find your pockets of Native Americans who don't like white involvement at all, but he says you'll also find many of us, he said, that appreciate the fact that you do. And I asked him about our visitations and the voices we were getting, and he thought it was profound as well. Now, also this last fall, I remember we were asking, and I was using the rods. As many of you know, I have these dowsing rods. These were made for me by John Ward, by an artisan in Luxor, Egypt, out of cast iron. And so handmade. And I can use these to ask a question. You hold them a little differently, and they'll do their crossing and their parting for yeses and nos and things like that. And I brought these to the site at Fort Snelling this last fall when Rocky and Rainey and Sarah and I were there. And we were getting voices over the box, and I used these for yes and no answers and questions. And we were standing on a site where I asked if I was in contact with somebody, and the rods they crossed. Now, some people find these dubious. They don't think there's much to them. I find that it's energy that gets put into them and that you use, and it manifests answers for you. And we found them coinciding sometimes with voices we were getting over the voice box. But all that to say this is, for a few minutes there, we were in contact with somebody who said he was a boy who had lived at that site, had been a prisoner in the concentration camp, and had died there. And I asked point blank, I asked him the question. I said, are you okay with us as Washti, white, talking to you, talking about your history? And it said yes. I asked if he trusted me, and it parted and it said no. And I said, is there something I can do to earn your trust? And it said yes. But right now, what came across in all the questions we asked, the bottom line was there was still a lack of trust because of who I was and what I was. I will say, on a paranormal scale, if you will, I got similar answers when I was in Egypt. And they contacted that man at the, Chris Conway was with me and got the ancient Egyptian man that said he would always be with me. And we asked his name, and he said back through Chris, he said, I won't give you my name until I trust you. And so a trust issue of and establishing that trust by communication, and so on. And so Reuben then he confirmed. He says I trust you, and I think that might give you a different answer the next time you're there. And as a matter of fact, and I'm looking forward to this day when we do this. Reuben had said he wanted to adopt me into the Lakota tribe. And so I'm looking forward to the day where we actually have that ceremony and we're able to do that. And there's more to that, and I'll let you know more about that as it comes. So all of this to say, I was talking about my interest in Native American history, my interest in what happened to Native America when the United States came and expanded west. And D. Brown wrote his book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, as a very poignant history of the Native American, the conquest of the Native American peoples. And I want to talk about this stuff for a few days, because I've got a few episodes lined up in my mind that I want to bring to your attention. And I want you to get an idea. We all have an idea of what it was like. The cowboys and Indians, the conquest of the West. If you're completely uninformed, if you remember the old movies, the Indians were always the bad guys, and the cowboys were always the good guys, with rare exception. And, you had to be an Indian hunter was the hero of the show and things like that. And I'm speaking in generalities here. We had an erroneous concept of what took place as we expanded into the West. And So I want to read a couple of sections from D. Brown's book, and I want to talk with you about what he has to say about this expansion. But the thing that kind of set me off on it this morning was I was reading, I had offhandedly and kind of jokingly asked of my friend Ruben Fasthorse, because, back this up, my wife, in planting the gardens in our yard, she went and she got some fish that her brother caught, and she took those fish, dead fish, and she buried them in the garden as fertilizer. And we were talking about how that was an old Native American custom. And I said, I wonder where that started. So I wrote Ruben, I just text messaged him really quickly. I said, where the hell did this whole idea of burying dead fish come from to fertilize a garden? How would Native Americans have known to do this in the first place? And it took him a few days before he saw my post, and he wrote back, and he sent me this little link and talking about the history of organics. This is Indian River Organics is the site. And he said that while there have been many advances in the field of agriculture, many of the modern techniques to grow food that is less nutritious, many of the modern techniques used to grow food really gives us less nutritious food grown just 50 years ago. And so today's methods of growing crops use synthetic fertilizers instead of organic, and that deprive our plants of many essential nutrients. And you can learn more about the history of fish fertilizer. Organic fish fertilizer provides additional nutritional supplements, like ones we get from vitamins, so your plants are going to be strong and vibrant. And the ancient people of North America knew this secret, and they cultivated many types of fruits and vegetables long before any European influence. And their use of fish fertilizer was traced as far back as the Roman Empire. Native Americans showed the Pilgrims how to grow corn by planting a fish with each corn plant. And the Mayans, the Incas, the Native Americans of the Southwest all used fish to grow crops. Why? It's not because they lacked our modern technology. It's because they knew that fish provides many necessary nutrients, and nutrients that plants don't get from fertilizer that contains just nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. And so how healthy would you be if your diet consisted of just sugar and bread? So, like you, plants need a broad spectrum of elements to grow strong and healthy, and fish fertilizer provides those. And in the textbook America, Its People and Values by Leonard C. Wood, Ralph H. Gabriel, and Edward L. Biller, the authors talk about colonial life here in America. And we particularly like this excerpt that explains Squanto's role in teaching colonists how to plant corn. And a friendly Indian named Squanto helped the early colonists. He showed them how to plant corn and how to live on the edge of the wilderness. As cultivating maize, a kind of corn, was unfamiliar to the Pilgrims, they relied on advice from Squanto, who shared with them the secret of proper maize planting technique. And sticking the seed in little heaps of dirt, accompanied by beans and squash that would later twine themselves up the tall stalks. And he told the Pilgrims to fertilize the soil by burying fish alongside the maize seed. And it's a traditional Native American technique for producing bountiful harvest. So following this advice, the colonists grew so much maize that it became the centerpiece of the first Thanksgiving. And another example can be found in George Mort's A Relation or Journal of the Beginning and Proceedings of the English Plantation at Plymouth in New England. There's a mouthful of a title for you. And from his book, he said, "We set the last spring some 20 acres of Indian corn, and sowed some 6 acres of barley and peas. And according to the manner of the Indians, we manured or fertilized our ground with herrings, or rather shads, which we have in great abundance, and take a great ease at our doors. Our corn did prove well, and God be praised, we had a good increase of Indian corn and barley indifferent good." And then there was also New England Canaan by Thomas Morton, where he said, "Set with these fish, every acre putting 1,000 fish, and an acre thus dressed will produce and yield so much as 3 acres without a fish." As so much as 3 acres would without fish. And so you can see fish fertilizer has been used for many centuries. And we have, the Pilgrims have Squanto to thank for that, individually anyway. And so that's what kind of set my mind thinking. I was reading this answer that Ruben had sent me about using fish. Where'd this come from? And so it's apparently a very ancient practice. But it got me to thinking about the topic for today, for talking about the Native American culture and how the United States culture wiped it out, how we conquered the West. In a day and age right now, current times, where racism is the big banner that's being thrown over everything, I think that there was a great deal of racism in the conquering of the American West. You had to see the people as inferior in order to treat them the way you did. They did back then. And so in looking at D. Book's, his first chapter, he entitled "Their Manners Are Decorous and Praiseworthy." This was a quote, and I believe it's from Lewis of Lewis and Clark. And there's a quote from Tecumseh of the Shawnee. He said this. He said, "Where today are the Pequot? Where are the Narragansett, the Mohican, the Paconacket, and many other once powerful tribes of our people? They have vanished before the avarice and the oppression of the white man, as snow before a summer sun. We will let ourselves be destroyed in our turn without a struggle, give up our homes, our country bequeathed to us by the Great Spirit, the graves of our dead, and everything that is dear and sacred to us. I know you will cry with me, never, never." That was Tecumseh of the Shawnee. And even though there's a lot of controversy over Christopher Columbus, this is really where it kind of began. He gave the people the name Indios, and these Europeans, these white men who spoke in different dialects, and some pronounced the word Indian or Indianer or Indian. The Porogues or Redskins came later, as was the custom of the people when receiving strangers. The Tainos on the island of San Salvador generously presented Columbus and his men with gifts and treated him with honor. "So tractable, so peaceable are these people," Columbus wrote to the King and Queen of Spain, "that I swear to your Majesties there is not in the world a better nation. They love their neighbors as they love themselves, and their discourse is ever sweet, gentle, and accompanied with a smile. And though it's true that they're naked, yet their manners are decorous and praiseworthy." This is what Columbus said about them, not Lewis and Clark. And he said all of this, of course, was taken as a sign of weakness. Now, that's more opinion that's put on it, but this is the day and age. They were a gentle people, a good people. They were praiseworthy because of their manners, but it was looked on as weakness, if not heathenism. And Columbus began being a righteous European, was convinced that the people should be made to work, quote unquote, he said, to sow and do all that's necessary to adopt our ways. And so his original intent was not enslavement at all, but to adopt them to European. Well, we got to teach these people what civilization is all about. And that's where the first mistake, I think, was made. And so over the next 4 centuries, 1492 to 1890, several million Europeans and their descendants undertook to enforce their ways upon the people of the New World. Pardon me, I got to take a little drink. Coffee. And so we got to end there because we're at the end of the first segment. We'll be back after this break. Sit tight. More to come.
Are you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, gang, we're back from that break. Thanks for sitting on, holding on, staying put. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. You're also watching via the simulcast in video with the live chat room and the Intrepheads joining in over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Welcome to the second segment of the show. Tonight we're talking a lot of bit, about looking back in again to the conquest of the American West by white Europeans. Now, I have to put this disclaimer in. I am not talking about white in the way that you're hearing all the political talk about white people. I'm talking about one nationality of people, Europeans, who came over to the New World and found that they could impose their ways on the native peoples that were living here. And this, of course, caused a lot of battling, it caused a lot of conflict, and it eventually ended up with the white settlers, the European settlers, driving the Native Americans off their land and really conquering the American West. And we ended the last segment talking about how Columbus, when he first got here, saw these people. He saw them as decorous and praiseworthy, as peaceful, smiling, loving their neighbors as themselves. He wrote all of this down about them. And all of this, of course, he took as a sign of weakness and felt that he needed to impose European ways upon them. And they undertook to enforce European methods and modes and practices and ways of life on the people of the New World. Now, Columbus kidnapped 10 of his friendly Taino hosts, and he carried them off to Spain. Some of the stories I've heard is he invited them on board ship, and then they set sail. And these guys didn't even know where they were being taken. And he took them to Spain, where they could be introduced to the white man's ways. That was Columbus's purpose. I've got to bring these guys and show them civilization. Now, remember, Columbus lived in an age where slavery was not as anathema as it is today. Slavery was a part of the world. It's the way the world worked. Now, he didn't take them as slaves, but because they were weaker than he was, he thought, and more backwater than they were, he thought by taking them to Spain, he could teach them all about real civilization, not civilization as they knew it and experienced it. And so he kidnapped 10 of them. One of them died soon after landing in Spain. And one of them, and he was also baptized as a Christian before he died. This is the way they thought they were not just teaching them civilization, but saving their souls. And so the Spaniards were so pleased that they'd made it possible for the first Indian to enter heaven that they hastened to spread the good news throughout the West Indies. We have saved the soul of an Indian man. First Indian going to heaven. That bristles me in ways that you don't know. And we won't get into that quite yet, but think about that for a second. We have introduced the Indians to God, and the first Indian has made it into the hands, the folded arms of Jesus in heaven. And so the Tainos and the other Arawak people didn't resist conversion to the Europeans' religion, but they did resist strongly when hordes of these bearded strangers began scouring their islands in search of gold and precious stones. The Spaniards looted and burned villages. They kidnapped hundreds of men, women, and children. They shipped them to Europe to be sold as slaves. For what reason? That they saw them as weak enough to do this to. That they had a simpler civilization than the European civilization. A happier civilization. They shipped them to slave by the hundreds, shipped them to Spain as slaves. The Arawak resistance to this, or they brought on the use of guns and sabers, and whole tribes were wiped out. They were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people in less than a decade after Columbus set foot on the beach of San Salvador in 1492. Communications between the tribes of the New World were slow. News of the Europeans' barbarities rarely overtook the rapid spread of new conquests and settlements. Long before the English-speaking white men arrived in Virginia in 1607, however, the Powhatans had heard rumors about the civilizing techniques of the Spaniards, and so the Englishmen used subtler methods. To ensure peace long enough to establish a settlement at Jamestown, they put a golden crown upon the head of Wahun Sonokuk, and they dubbed him the King Powhatan, and they convinced him that he should put his people to work supplying the white settlers with food, with other necessities. Wahun I'm looking for the emphasis on the syllables. Wahun Sonokuk vacillated between loyalty to his rebellious subjects and to the English. But after John Rolfe married his daughter Pocahontas, he apparently decided that he was more English than Indian. And so after Wahun Sonokuk died, the Powhatans rose up in revenge to drive the Englishmen back into the sea from where they'd come. But the Indians underestimated the power of English weapons, and in a short time the 8,000 Powhatans were reduced to less than 1,000 by the English. In Massachusetts, the story began a bit differently, but it ended virtually the same as in Virginia. After the Englishmen landed at Plymouth in 1620, the Pilgrims, most of them, and we get a different picture of the Pilgrims in grade school. We do know that they were fleeing England for religious freedom, but they brought with them the European ways. And most of them probably would have starved to death, except for the aid they received from the friendly natives in the New World. A Pemaquid named Samoset and 3 Wampanagos named Massasoit, Squanto, and Hoboma became self-appointed missionaries to the Pilgrims. The Indians sent their people out to help them. And all of them spoke some English. They were learned from explorers who touched ashore in previous years. And Squanto had been kidnapped by the English, by an English seaman who sold him into slavery in Spain. He's a free man walking around in his world, and he's kidnapped by a British sailor who sells him into slavery in Spain. But he escaped through the aid of another Englishman and finally managed to make it back home to America. And he and the other Indians regarded the Plymouth colonists as they looked at them and saw them as helpless children. Not a derogatory, but they're like kids. They do not know what they're doing. They will kill themselves. And they shared corn with them from the tribal stores. Squanto was the one who showed them how to use fish as fertilizer. They showed them where and how to catch the fish, and they got them through the first winter. And when spring came, they gave the white men some seed corn, showed them how to plant and cultivated it, and for several years, these Englishmen and their Indian neighbors lived in peace. But many more shiploads of white people continued coming ashore. And the ring of axes, the clash of falling trees, echoed up and down the coasts of the land, which the white men now called New England. All of a sudden, could you imagine going out, living here in America, or where you are in Australia or Great Britain? Any of my listeners, look at your home country. If suddenly people started just showing up from somewhere else and started chopping down all your trees, and you're going, hey. And then you find out they've renamed it New England. And so for several years, this is what they did. And settlements began crowding in upon each other. In 1625, 5 years after the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, some of the colonists asked Samoset to give them 12,000 additional acres of Pemaquid land. Now, Samoset knew that land came from the Great Spirit and was as endless as the sky and belonged to no man as property. So to humor these strangers, and in their strange ways, he went through a ceremony of transferring the land and made his mark upon a paper for him. And it was the first deed of Indian land to English colonists. Man, they grasped that as their deed of ownership to that land. Now, most of the other settlers, coming in by thousands at this point, didn't bother to go through such a ceremony. And by the time Massasoit, great chief of the Wampanoags, died in 1662, this is 42 years after the Pilgrims landed, his people were being pushed back into the wilderness. And his son, Metacom, foresaw doom for all Indians unless they united to resist the invaders. How do you think the battling started? You get pushed in far enough away from your homeland, this is what happens. And they weren't hostile to begin with. They became hostile to protect what they had, to protect their homes. And although the New Englanders flattered Metacom by crowning him King Philip of Pokanoket, he devoted most of his time to forming alliances with the Narragansetts and other tribes in the region. And in 1675, again for perspective, this is 55 years after the Pilgrims landed, after a series of arrogant actions by colonists, King Philip Metacom led his Indian Confederacy into a war meant to save the tribes from extinction at the hands of white Europeans. The Indians attacked 52 settlements, completely destroying 12 of them. But after months of fighting, with firepower of the colonists virtually exterminated, the Wampanoags and the Narragansetts. And King Philip was killed, and his head cut off and put on public display, exhibited at Plymouth for nearly 20 years. Along with other captured Indian women and children, King Philip, Metacom's wife, and other captured women, and his young son were sold into slavery in the West Indies. This is what happened to his family. So when the Dutch came to Manhattan Island, Peter Minuit purchased it for 60 guilders in fish hooks and glass beads. But he encouraged the Indians to remain and continued exchanging their valuable peltries for such trinkets. And in 1641, William Kieft levied tribute upon the Mohicans and sent soldiers to Staten Island to punish the Raritans for offenses which had been committed not by them, but by white settlers. The Raritans resisted arrest, and the soldiers killed 4 of them. When the Indians retaliated by killing 4 Dutchmen, Kieft ordered the massacre of 2 entire villages while the inhabitants slept. The Dutch soldiers ran their bayonets through men, women, and children, hacked their bodies to pieces, and then leveled the villages with fire. What kind of public relations do you suppose they were establishing there? This was about 20 years after the Pilgrims had landed. And so for 2 more centuries, these events were repeated again and again as the European colonists moved inland through the passes of the Alleghenies, down the westward flowing rivers to the great waters, the Mississippi, and then up the Great Muddy, the Missouri. The 5 nations of the Iroquois, mightiest and most advanced of all the eastern tribes of the Native Americans, strove in vain for peace with the white Europeans. After years of bloodshed to save their political independence, they finally went down to defeat. Some escaped to Canada, some fled westward, some lived out their lives in reservation confinement. Now, during the 1760s, Pontiac of the Ottawas, not a car, a chief, Pontiac of the Ottawas, united tribes in the Great Lakes country, and that's up where we are now, where I am in Wisconsin, the Great Lakes country, in hopes of driving the British back across the Allegheny Mountains. But he failed. His major error was an alliance with French-speaking white men who withdrew aid from the Peau Rogues, the Redskins, during the crucial siege of Detroit. A generation later, Tecumseh of the Shawnee, he formed a great confederacy of Midwestern and Southern tribes to protect their lands from invasion by the Europeans. The dream ended with Tecumseh's death in battle during the War of 1812. So between 1795 and 1840, the Miamis fought battle after battle. They signed treaty after treaty. They ceded their rich Ohio Valley lands until there was none left to cede. When white settlers began streaming into the Illinois country after the War of 1812, the Sauks, the Foxes, they fled across the Mississippi. And a subordinate chief, Black Hawk, refused to retreat. He created an alliance with the Winnebagos, the Potawatomis, and the Kickapoos, and declared war against new settlements of white Europeans. Look how they were... Stop for a minute. And look at how these people were driven to do what they did. They're painted in American history as hostiles who attacked us. As we were just putting up settlements, they attacked settlers. Well, what's missing in that history that we were taught for many years was that they were driven to the point of defending their homeland. Would not we do the same thing if we were invaded? Yes, we would. Now, times are different, obviously. We have different weapons. We have different kinds of armies. Our nation is different now. It's a nation built by defeating and pushing out the people who lived here. That's just history. You can't change that now. It is what it is now. But what do we do from this point on, having this knowledge? I don't feel guilt. I feel sadness that my ancestors did this way. My ancestors, as I mentioned earlier, came over in 1710 and settled in Virginia, Goochland County, Virginia. By 1710, 90 years after the Pilgrims first set foot at Plymouth Rock, having nothing, there was already Goochland County in Virginia, well established 90 years later. I don't know what part my own ancestors played in their relationships with the Native American tribes. I do know 5 grandsons of John Robards, my ancestor who came over from Wales in 1710, fought in the American Revolution. But look at this now, You're talking 1776 to 1782, in that range of time. You're quite a bit further out from the Pilgrims in 1620, but 150 to 160 years later. So about the time the Civil War in this country to now, that period of time is what it took for us to be engaged in a revolutionary war, defending 13 established colonies. So just to put it in perspective. So it's interesting that a band of Winnebagos, now this is under Black Hawk, remember who I just said had put together the Winnebagos, the Potawatomis, and the Kickapoos and declared war against the new settlements. A band of Winnebagos who accepted a white soldier chief's bribe of 20 horses and $100 betrayed Black Hawk, and he was captured in 1832. He was taken east for imprisonment and display to the curious. And after he died in 1838, 6 years later, the governor of the recently created Iowa Territory obtained Black Hawk's skeleton and kept it on display in his office. That's pretty heinous. You think of that in modern terms. Imagine if the governor of your state kept the skeleton of somebody in his office and put it on display. So in 1829, Andrew Jackson, who was called Sharp Knife by the Indians, took office as the President of the United States. He's on our $50 bill. And during his frontier career, Sharp Knife and his soldiers had killed, murdered thousands of Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creek, and Seminoles. But these southern Indians were still numerous, and they clung stubbornly to their tribal lands, which had been assigned them forever by the white man's treaty in perpetuity. We talked about that before. Many of these treaties contain the terms from the United States to them in perpetuity. Forever. This treaty will stand. And they signed many treaties that had that language in it. In Sharp Knife's first message to his Congress, he recommended that all these Indians be removed westward beyond the Mississippi. Let's get them out of here. And he said, this is a quote from Jackson, I suggest the propriety of setting apart an ample district west of the Mississippi to be guaranteed to the Indian tribes as long as they shall occupy it. Now, although the enactment of such a law would only add to the long list of broken promises that were made to the Eastern Indians, Sharp Knife was convinced that Indians and whites could not live together in peace. You know what that meant? They can't live together in peace because we keep taking their shit from them. And they get pissed off about it. We can't live at peace with these people. From a 21st century perspective, you shake your head at this. And his plan would make it possible a final promise which would never be broken again. So he says, so on May 28th of 1830, Sharp Knife's recommendations, Sharp Knife being Andrew Jackson, his recommendations to his Congress became law. So 2 years later, he appointed a commissioner of Indian Affairs to serve in the War Department and see that the new laws affecting Indians were properly carried out. And then on June 30th in 1834, Congress passed an act to regulate trade and intercourse with the Indian tribes and to preserve peace on the frontiers. That was the name of the act. And all that part of the United States west of the Mississippi and not within the states of Missouri and Louisiana or the territory of Arkansas would be Indian country. No white persons would be permitted to trade in the Indian country without a license. No white traders of bad character, traders, D-E-R-S. No white traders of bad character would be permitted to reside in Indian country. No white persons would be permitted to settle in Indian country. This is west of the Mississippi. And the military force of the United States would be employed in the apprehension of any white person who was found in violation of provisions of the act. Now, before these laws could be put into effect, a new wave of white settlers swept westward and formed the territories of Wisconsin, and Iowa. And this made it necessary for the policymakers in Washington to, we got to shift the permanent Indian frontier from the Mississippi River to the 95th meridian. And this line ran from Lake of the Woods on what's now the Minnesota-Canadian border. Lake of the Woods, if you look at a map of Minnesota, I've been up to Lake of the Woods. Gorgeous up there. This is what they call the Boundary Waters territory. It's in the north of Minnesota and over into Canada. It's about 6 hours north of here by car. So the new line ran from Lake of the Woods on what's now the Minnesota-Canadian border, slicing southward through what's now the states of Minnesota and Iowa, and then along the western borders of Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana to Galveston Bay, Texas. Straight south. And to keep the Indians beyond the 95th meridian, west of it, and to prevent unauthorized white men from crossing over into it, soldiers were garrisoned in a series of military posts that ran southward from Fort Snelling, where Rocky and Rainey and Sarah and I have been a couple of times. I've been there many, many times, by the way. I grew up with Fort Snelling in my backyard in Minneapolis. And so it started southward from Fort Snelling on the Mississippi River to Forts Atkinson, Leavenworth in Missouri, Forts Gibson and Smith on the Arkansas, Fort Townsend on the Red, and Fort Jessup in Louisiana. So more than 3 centuries had now passed since Columbus landed in San Salvador, and more than 2 centuries since the English colonists came to Virginia and New England. And in that time, the friendly Tainos who welcomed Columbus ashore had been utterly obliterated. Long before the last of the Tainos died, their simple agricultural and handicraft culture was destroyed and replaced by cotton plantations worked by slaves. The white colonists chopped down the tropical forests to enlarge their fields. The cotton plants exhausted the soil. Winds unbroken by a forest shield covered the fields with sand. And when Columbus first saw the island, he described it as very big, very level, and trees very green. The whole of it so green that it was a pleasure to gaze upon. And the Europeans who followed him there destroyed its vegetation, its inhabitants, human, animal, bird, and fish. And after turning it to a wasteland, they abandoned it. That's all we've got time for tonight. You can see why I want to pick this up again tomorrow and look at this more. I think this is important history that we learn and we know and we understand. That's all I got tonight. Think on these things. 23-hour break. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a good night.